In the late 1950s and early 1960s, stomach ulcers began to appear en masse among Soviet Air Force bomber pilots. For this reason, doctors decommissioned many pilots. To study the causes of this strange anomaly, in the fall of 1963, a group of highly qualified military doctors arrived from Moscow to the Air Regiment in Poltava. Research was conducted in several squadrons for 3 months, after which the doctors left, but the results of their work were classified, and the pilots were not told anything about them. But everyone guessed that the frequent illnesses of the pilots were a consequence of the stress they received during refueling of aircraft in the air, which was just then being mastered in bomber aviation units. In the Soviet Union, a refueling scheme in the air was introduced which was called wing-to-wing. This system was not used anywhere else in the world. It was considered strange and too risky. In the USSR, on the contrary, it was perceived as much more effective and simpler than those used by the British and Americans. In reality, wing-to-wing refueling turned out to be an extremely complex operation, requiring enormous nervous tension and strength from pilots, and, of course, high skill. But even despite the fact that, in the 1960s, only first-class pilots were commanders of aircraft crews performing in-flight refueling, its development was paid for at the cost of great losses. In just 2 bomber air regiments based in Prilupki and Poltava, 15 aircraft crashed from 1958 to 1964, killing 90 crew members. In the Soviet Union, the first experiments in refueling aircraft in the air were conducted in 1931. The method of these operations was as elementary as in the first experiments conducted in other countries at the end of the 1920s. From a flying tanker aircraft using a hand winch, a hose several tens of meters long was released. A weight of about 9 pounds was attached to the end of the hose to stabilize it in flight, as well as a shutoff valve. On the refueled aircraft, flying slightly below the tanker, this hose had to be manually caught and inserted into the receiving neck of the fuel tank. Then the valves were opened, and the fuel was transferred by gravity to the receiving aircraft. Of course, when refueling, the aircraft had to fly together, strictly maintaining the required position relative to each other. All these operations were carried out at speeds of no more than 200 kilometers per hour. In the first experiments, our 5 aircraft with additional fuel tanks served as tankers, and TB-1 bombers, then TB-3 bombers served as receivers. Before the beginning of World War II, experiments were conducted with some other types of fighters, but that was all. They remembered about aerial refueling only when it became necessary to deliver the newly created atomic bomb to the territory of the USA. At that time, in the USSR, only the long-range bomber Tu-4, successfully copied from the American B-29 Superfortress, could be used as a carrier of the atomic bomb. But the plane's range was only 5,100 kilometers, making the pilot's mission a one-way trip. Refueling en route would give them a theoretical chance to return home, but the plane could only be refueled in flight. Despite the fact that several successful methods of refueling aircraft in flight had already been developed and used in world aviation in the 1950s, the USSR decided to go its own way. They took as a basis the refueling method proposed by pilots Vasyunin and Shellist, which became known as wing-to-wing refueling or wing refueling. At first, wing refueling was tested on propeller-driven Tu-2 bombers from World War II. This happened in June 1949. Then, from March 1952, it began to be used on Tu-4 bombers, but was only partially mastered by the Air Force. The total number of Tu-4 tankers and receivers did not exceed 10 aircraft, according to other sources, about 50. In a slightly modified version, wing refueling was introduced on Tu-16 bombers. The first experiments with this type of aircraft were conducted in 1955. Since 1957, it began to be installed on Tu-16 bombers in series at all 3 factories that produced them. The wing-to-wing refueling system on the Tu-16 worked as follows. A 40-meter hose was released from the end of the tanker's right wing on a cable of the same length, a total of 80 meters. At the end of the hose was a small stabilizing parachute. The receiver maneuvered so that the edge of its left wing was at the end of the hose. Then the hose slid off the end of the receiver's wing and was hooked onto a special hook on the receiving unit. The tanker then pulled the cable until the end of the hose approached the receiver's receiving unit, where it was connected to the refueling neck. The recipient occupied a position relative to the tanker so that the hose formed a loop, and the receiving unit on its wing, at the same time, turned 180 degrees. After the fuel transfer was completed, the hose was disconnected and pulled into the tanker. Thus, the Tu-16 could take up to 20,000 kilograms of fuel, which took about 10 minutes. A virtuoso piloting technique was required for the operation to be successful. The maneuvering altitude during refueling was from 6 to 10,000 meters, depending on the weather. The flight speed was from 600 to 800 kilometers per hour. The participating aircraft had to approach each other at a distance of 6 to 8 meters between the wings. Before docking, the speeds of both aircraft had to be perfectly aligned. Otherwise, the hose would either break or wrap around the wing in a loop, which would cause the aircraft to fall. This emergency phenomenon was called the Jibolevich loop, after the Tu-16 commander who first discovered it, at the cost of his own life and the lives of the entire crew. The same tragic outcome occurred when the wing of the aircraft being refueled got caught in the exhaust stream from the tanker's engines or in the wingtip vortices. The bomber was rocked, which could lead to it capsizing or colliding with the tanker. For night refueling, several additional light bulbs were installed along the right wing of the tanker, whose filaments, in most cases, fell off due to vibration during takeoff. As a result, during refueling, the tanker navigator was forced to illuminate the hose with a powerful portable lamp. Because of the large sweep of the Tu-16 wing, the commander of the aircraft receiving the fuel could not see the end of the left wing of his aircraft and, accordingly, could not see the hose. At this time, the commander of the firing installations sitting in the tail became the pilot's assistant. He adjusted the flight control, reporting to the commander, a little to the left, a little to the right, a little higher, a little lower, and so on. If during refueling there was a disconnection or some other failure, the pilot might not have enough strength for a second attempt, primarily nerves. The doctors who conducted the research in the Poltava Regiment nevertheless declassified part of the results of their work, publishing an article in the newspaper of the armed forces. It was written in it that during one flight with refueling in the air, pilots on average lost up to 5% of their weight. This is about 4 kilograms. The pulse rate increased to 186 beats per minute, and in some cases 220, with the norm being 76 to 80. The respiratory rate became an average of 64 breaths instead of 15 to 16, as on the ground. Even with the mask turned on to high oxygen, the pilots had breathing failures. It is also interesting to note the fact that those who fell ill due to nerves were more often not the aircraft commanders who controlled the plane during refueling, but the second pilots who sat nearby, watched everything, and could in no way interfere with the actions of the commander, even if he made obvious gross mistakes. In total, 114 Tu-16 bombers were equipped as tankers for wing refueling. According to other sources, only 46. 571 aircraft were modified to receive fuel in the air, which was more than a third of the total number of Tu-16s produced. Experiments were also conducted with wing refueling of Yak-15 and MiG-15 fighters, but in this case, this scheme was abandoned. In 1964, after the Soviet military was armed with intercontinental missiles, wing-to-wing refueling was canceled in the Soviet Air Force, but was retained by naval aviation, where it was used in the 1990s. Over time, the Soviet Air Force adopted a hose cone refueling system, which is also known as Probendrog.